Okay. Welcome, Lexie.
Okay. So I thought it was a fun Siman to end this with. Obviously, we're not ending yet, but to end this section with. And I feel like while going through it, I want to keep a couple things in mind for both like Klalim and also something kind of to like talk about slash would love people's input in. First of all, we have things coming up all the time of like, you can't declare a permitted thing usher, right? So like something that like is a really big cloud throughout this siman is the idea that like shani omer only works because we believe that things can stay like bechezkatam, right? And that little like trick doesn't work if that would mean me ushering something that's currently heter. Another thing is the idea that shani omer doesn't work with isurei deoraita. That's like something that is stated explicitly in the Siman, but also comes up multiple times throughout the commentaries where they're explaining like, wait, how does that work here? And the other thing that I just kind of want to talk about throughout it is what are people imagining the Mitziu looking like? Because I think for some of these, and like honestly, it surprised me that some of the Nosei Kalim didn't talk about it even more. But we see, especially in like the first Drisha, where he's kind of freaking out, being like, how does this happen, right? That like you can have this physical situation where either like I don't know that it's in this thing, or I like know the amount of this thing but I couldn't take this out. Essentially, like what are these situations that we have where like we know or don't know x amount about these things, but we can't necessarily remove the isser, or if we are removing the isser, yeah, it's complicated. There's a lot of like moving balls, but I think it's like worthwhile to talk about. So I think we can just start with the first Shulchan Aruch. Does somebody want to read? It's always better when we just call on people. Asher, could you read the first Shulchan Aruch?
Hey, 1 second, he's filling kufiyot for some reason. And it's long. Okay. שתי גדרות, אחד של היתר ואחד של איסור, ולפניו שתי חתיכות, אחד של היתר ואחד של איסור. אם החתיכה היא מאיסור דרבנן, כגון שומנות של גיד, ונפלו אלו לתוך אלו מותרים. שאנו תולים לומר, האיסור נפל לתוך האיסור וההיתר לתוך ההיתר. So we got two pots, one with kosher meat in it, the other with some non-kosher meat. You've got these two chunks of meat right in front of these two pots. One of them is kosher, one of them is non-kosher. The friend I was learning with, just because we were, like you were saying, we're trying to imagine when would this actually happen. He said you're at a campground with your kosher pot and your kosher meat, and this guy from Oklahoma is right next to you with his pot and his meat, and somehow things get confused. The two pieces fall into the pot. You're not sure which piece fell into which pot. So we say it's all mutar. Oh, and it's only if it's something to Rabbanan, for example, the fat from Gid and Asheh. They fell into the pot. We say that they're allowed, that you're not going to worry about the piece of meat. You're not going to worry about which piece of meat fell into your kosher pot, as long as you know which the kosher pot is, because we are inclined to say that Isur falls into Isur and a Heter falls into Heter. ואפילו אם ההיתר שבקדרה אינו רבה עד שלפניה, וכן הדין. And even if there is more of the Isur that fell into this pot than the heter that was already sitting there, if it was in fact an Isur, we still say it's still the din. Im lo haya kan ela kdera achat. Okay, and now Isur goes into sort of a whole second case. Im lo haya kan ela kdera achat. There was only one pot shel basar shchuta of kosher meat. V'nafal ba achat me'elu ashtei chatichot. One of these two pieces of meat fell in. ואינו ידוע איזו היא, אינו תולים דשל היתר נפלה. אפילו אין ההיתר רבה על האיסור. But if there's one pot and two pieces of meat and you're not sure which piece of meat fell in, then we don't fall back on what we said earlier when it was two pots, even if there's more of the heter than the isur. We're not even going to debatel it.
No, we do. So for this, in this first one, all of them are batel. I think it's a little confusing because we have anu, and eno come up multiple times, which I think is very confusing language.
Okay, that could be where I got lost.
In Aleph, we can say shani omer.
Okay, hold on, wait, let me do. Okay, sorry, you're right. Now I see how I misread that. Anatolin de Shel Heter Nafla, Afino Ena Heter Rabala Isur, even if the Heter is not more than Isur. או אם לא היה כאן אלא חתיכה אחת מהאיסור, זה רבנן, ויש שתי קטרות, even if you have one piece of איסור דרבנן, and two pots, אחד של היטב ואחד של איסור, ואין ידוע לאיזה נפלה, גם בזאת עולים להקל. Even then we're inclined to be makil.
Yes. Okay. So I feel like and we get into this, I think the Beit Yosef is like multiple people. We're talking about, but they make it explicit here, Isurei Derabanan, right? And so it's both Isurei Derabanan, like the Gid Hanashat that he mentions, and he also says this works with like Isurei Torah, but like Shiurim Derabanan, which means like if we're imagining what this is, right? He gives the example of like Shamno Shel Gid, or like if it's like Isurei Doraita, right? But like Shir, like a Shir Derabanan. It's kind of like what we were talking about before, right? When we're talking about like the nevela that can be batel barov. It's like little scrap meat, as it were, right? Like we're not envisioning in this case where you don't even need like a rove of heter. We're not envisioning like a whole like steak falls into one of these things and into the other. It's like kind of like, stuff was like sprinkled in, right? Like I feel like we can see throughout this. Yeah, no, and we'll talk more.
Both are possibilities.
Huh?
If it could be a big piece, right?
We'll get to there. But for this scenario, it can either be something like the Shomno Shel Gid, which whatever, I honestly don't have a great estimate of how much of that there is. Shomno Shel Gid could fall in however much there is, and that's Dirabanan, so this would work. But with like a Doraita Isser, it would need to be a pretty small amount. Like a very small amount for this to be fine.
No, well again, if it's min b'mina, it's batel b'rov, do it right there. As long as it's not rov. Be a big piece.
Yes,
even
as
there.
in I'm saying for things, I'm saying the amount that we don't care, essentially, where we don't need a rove. It's like when you imagine that something that's so tiny fell in. And now we'll get to the next bit, which I think, like, if you didn't read the next bit after this, like the bit here where we talk about the fact that you don't need a rove of heter, like, to me, before moving on, it would imply like, oh, like there can even be like rove isser. And this like Shani Omer process would still work. Because once I say that I don't have rove heter and I can't use that like proper beetle process, then I'm like, okay, that's just not what we're relying upon. But we will see that that is not the case. But before we get there, also, does somebody want to read the Darchei Moshe Aleph here real quick? Because I think he just brings up very briefly an interesting point. Isaac, can you read that?
Sorry, where?
The Darchei Moshe Aleph.
Moshe Aleph. If I can find it on Vertical. Uh-oh. Hang on. I seem to be in an odd position where Darchei Moshe has disappeared from my page.
Go to the bait. Are you in the tour?
No, I'm in the Shulchan Aruch.
Go to the tour.
Oh,
Sorry,
wow.
yeah.
Awesome.
Be in a different safe there.
That would be my issue. Okay, hang on a sec. Sorry. Okay. Sorry, Yoda Yod Aleph.
The Darchei Moshe Aleph. Ubepirish Ran Perkar.
No, I have a completely different Darchei Moshe. I honestly have no idea what's
Turn the
going
page. Turn to the next page because it's a little
It's
confusing.
Kuf Yud Aleph Aleph.
Still on.
on. Oh, okay, great. With Ferush Perek Harel Daf Tzav Lamed Aleph, וזה לשונו, ואפשר לעניין איסורי משהו החמורים לא תלינן לכולה, אפילו באיסורי דרבנן, בפקוד מרבייה, דהיינו שיהא בהתר רוב נגד האיסור שנפל בו עד כאן לשונו. Okay, so basically, we say that it's possible that when you're dealing with any amount of Isur that's from one of these very serious Isurim, we don't rule the Kula, even if they're Derabanan, unless you have a 1-to-2 ratio and you can have Batel Barov. Yeah, that's it. So in other words, he's saying, yes, he's backing up exactly what Lexie just said about even Derabanan, we may be concerned even about small amounts.
You need rove. You need rove.
Yes.
Right. Well, yeah, we need rove, and specifically with these, which like I think makes sense. Like, right, the Ron is adding kind of this additional, I guess, complexity to our hierarchy here, which is that like technically there are things that like would only be like in Isser Durabanan. Actually, what is a good example of this? Something that'd be an Isser Durabanan, but in Isser Mash.
Chametz bepesach. Chametz bepesach.
Isser Durabanan?
Not Derabanan.
Oh, here.
Chametz bepesach is the mashahu is Isser
Fine.
Durabanan.
Okay. So in that case, we're saying like theoretically that should fall into this category of things that's like a sheer durabanan, so it should be batel. They're like, there's a reason kind of like when we say mashahu is like other or something, we say that like we think this thing is significant enough that I think it like makes like some measure of sense to say that like, okay, minimally we're gonna ask for a rove, which is like a huge kula, right? A huge kula for things that are generally like oser b'mashahu. To say, okay, we can still say like the sha'ani omer in this case, but you just need to have a rove. Like to say, like, we think this is important enough that like minimally we want this kind of like, I don't even want to use the word heker because like, I don't know if that's the right term to use here, but like, even though technically according to our formalist hierarchy before this should be fine, even if they're like the midot are like shavin, here we're going to require a rove.
Lexie, I didn't look into the Nimokei Yosef here, but like, do you know what his logic is? Like, why? Like, we remove that one thing of like you don't even need rove, but you know everything else we can still say shani omer. You know, like for something that's an iser b'mashu.
No, I think I take back my example. I think that maybe I'm wrong. I think Lexie's complex worry is maybe right. In other words, you'd have to, I think it's something that is Asur D'Rabbanan and the rabbis prohibited b'mashahu, which I don't know what that is.
It's davar
Maybe
minyan,
there's
rawi lichabed.
Yeah, we like it likabed.
I
All those
see.
categories.
But if a
Gotcha. Okay.
though, that would be Asur D'Rabbanan, because most of the like meat isurim are Asur D'Oraita.
No, but you
Right. In other words, you know what Lexie is saying,
Yeah.
the way I understand Lexie, she's saying the thing itself should be Asur D'Rabbanan, like maybe chicken that was cooked in milk is Asur D'Rabbanan.
That's a
And now it's a chaticha ruya litchabed because it's a nice piece
Yeah.
of chicken. And it falls into, that's what you have to say. It's also Isser Rabbanan and also Isser Mashu
but well, yeah.
separately.
I mean, it could also though be what you said though, where the iser itself is derabanan as b'mashahu, and the
Where it's Isser Deraita, but the Shiur is, I don't think that's what he's talking
no,
about.
because
no, it can't be. It can't be. Yeah. I'm thinking about it.
we're already
Yeah.
talking about. We already mentioned those, right? The idea
Yeah.
of something that's an Isser D'Oraita, but the shear is only a D'Rabbanan Isser.
The best example is what I said, the chicken in the milk.
No, I
Yeah.
think the chicken's a good example. Both, even if we like, in addition to the fact that like, you know, the Beit Yosef and the other sources include, right, Isser D'Oraita, Sheer D'Rabbanan in their sources of things, they say have the same deen of Isser D'Rabbanan. I feel like also if we're talking about this practically, it makes sense for them to be talking about a thing that is an Isser D'Rabbanan and not just talking about the thing being B'mashahu. Because I'm saying, okay, you need a rove when the chametz is like bimashu, like, okay, no, if you have something in a pot, it's probably a rove over like a crumb of chametz, like, realistically speaking. So yeah, I think the chicken and the milk is a good example. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to look at on this seif is the question of the last case here, where both the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch, also the Beit Yosef mentions the beginning of this, that like this entire Siman is based off of the Rashba. Most of it is just like quoting stuff from him. There are questions around to what extent things are kind of edited or rearranged and how that like impacts our interpretation. But we see this language of gam bezeh tolin lahakel at the end, which is the scenario of if you only have one chaticha, you have two kederot, like echad shel cheter ve'echad shel isur, and like that we can also say that the Chav Isser fell into the Kedera of Isser, and it's fine. So the Beit Yosef is like disturbed by the use of like the language here, because he thinks it seems to imply that like we would consider this to be more machmir, right? That like the gam bizo, like maybe your first thought is like, if I hadn't told you this, you would have thought that would be usser. And he's like, no, like adarabba, like this should be a kol shekain kind of issue. And he ends up explaining it that way. He ends up saying that what the Torah is doing with this language is saying like a kol shekain, like this case with the one piece where I can say that nothing fell into the heter, right? As opposed to the first case where like something fell into each pot. I think it makes sense, right? His intuition that like, this would be a more makil thing, where there's the possibility that literally nothing fell into the heter pot, whereas one where I know something fell into both of these. And so I just have to say this fell there, this fell there. So he ends up saying that it's like a case of just saying kol shekain. But then I think we get a critique of that. Do people have, so in the Torah, if people have the Prisha, Joel, would you be willing to read the Prisha bet?
Yeah. Is it v'chen adin b'chulei afilu im ein heter rabba al isur, or im lo hayta kan ela chaticha achat mi'isur d'Rabbanan? Okay. Katav Beit Yosef, d'din ze kol sheken dema im hayu kan shtei chatichot, achat shel isur v'achat shel heter v'naflu shtei kederot, devadai gam lekdera shel heter nafla chaticha achat, afilu hachi anu tolim da'akel, v'lomar she'heter nafal toch heter, כל שכן באין שם אלא חתיכה אחת של איסור ונפל לתוך אחד מהקדרות, שיש שליטות להקל ולומר לתוך של איסור נפל, שהרי לא ראינו כלום שנפל לתוך היתר. עד כאן דברו probably, or something like that. Okay, that's all the Beit Yosef, just it's really what Lexie just said, where he says it's a kol sheken. If I know that there are two pieces, one is kasher, one is not, they fell into two different pots, I can be told that they fell into their own kind of pot, shall we say? Then all the more so with a case where I know that it's possible nothing even fell into the heter pot, that I can make that claim. So, okay. But v'dochaku lomar d'Rabbeinu zo, ve'in tzarich lomar zo katani ve'od, d'Rabbeinu dikdek lomar gam bezot tolin lakel. Mashma de'af im tolin lakel b'shnei chatichot haya mistaber le'esor b'chaticha achat ad shusrach lomar gam bezot tolin lakel. So I have to back up and see what I just read, but it's dochak. But to say this, but
it's just saying that it's not a kol sheken. It is like something that you might have thought to asul, but the Rabbeinu the Tool has a reason, or the Rashba has reasons to. I mean, Rabbeinu even for that case.
Lomar gam bezot tolin. When he says gam, the language of the Torah was gam bezot, right? So yeah. So go ahead.
Like is another kind of way essentially of saying kol shekain.
Yeah. Are you saying that gam bezot is also kol shekain?
As in, I think when he says that like doche kulomar d'Rabbeinu zov ein tzarich lomar zog tane. That's like the phrase, as in like very like the way of saying zov ein tzarich lomar zo is like another. I think what he's saying is like this idea of another way of phrasing that it was in fact like a kol shekain in this case. That
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
I was trying to use that language.
But ve'od the Rabbeinu dikdek lamar gam bazo tolin lakel mashma de'afim tolin lakel b'shnei chatichot haya mistaber le'esor b'chaticha achad ad shusrach lamar gam bazo tolin lakel. Okay, yeah. So that's the same idea. So
right, but he still has to present why we would think this case is more severe.
More severe than it, yeah. So okay. Vinira lefioniatati. The lav kol shekanhu the b'shnei chatichot achad shel isur v'achad shel heter v'achad shel heter are the shnehem nitarvu ze im ze kodem nefilatan b'ktera. All right. So what do we? He says, right. It's not a kol shekan. We're talking about two chatichot, right? One of isur, one of heter, and the two of them were mixed together before they ever fell into the ketera. And so what happens? Nimsad afilu b'shat nefila ein kan isur mevurar al shum echad mehem. Right. Therefore, it's not obvious that there's like there's no obvious or distinct isur, maybe is the right word, that on either of them. So
he redefines. Which case did he redefine?
He redefined the first case.
The first case.
Yeah. So.
He redefined the first case. He says he couldn't really redefine the last case, so he said, "I'll redefine the first case," and so he turned it into a suffix d'Rabbanan.
Right? He's like,
actually, on each one.
If I want this to not be a kol shekain, if I want this to make more sense linguistically, how do I make the first case more makil?
More makil, exactly.
Like make it mercel at the end of the day. So it's
of course it's a suffix d'Rabbanan.
Yeah,
he's turned it into a suffix d'Rabbanan, maybe lahakil, like already without it falling.
Yeah,
because it's only a rabbinic isser, and now I don't know which one is which.
He's gonna bring that. So he brings. So just like finish up because he mentions what would be the meaning of those pieces versus.
Great. So that's in the first case, right? But in our case, where it's one piece, right? Because now we having no an iser that's going to fall into one of these two pots. This is all right. Be'in sham elachat. This is brilliant. Shehi vadai shel isur. Okay. But ve'in listapek bazeh diyesh le'atir tzvei benitarvu kodem lachen. Right. So don't worry that there might be that we should be more mutar when they're first mixed up. Deha Beit Yosef katav b'sof Siman kuftet b'shem hagat sharidura shekatav b'shem or zarua shim nitarev davar yavesh be'isur d'Rabbanan afilu lo nitarev el echad bechad mutar b'achila v'chulei. ואף אגב דלה קיימלן הכי, מכל מקום נראה להביא ראיה מזה שיש להקל בנידון דידן.
Okay, so that's basically the important part, right? But like I thought it was very clever as you were saying. He's saying like, okay, like because we have this thing, we don't actually end up ruling that when there's chad b'chad, like it would be fine for me to eat those pieces themselves. But given that there is that opinion,
it's a snif lakel at the end of the day.
Yeah,
you know? Yeah,
exactly. Yavni.
Yeah, so I was reading the Torah in the Shulchan Aruch as when it talks about you don't need the heter to be rov on the isur to be about the heter in the pot that it got mixed into. But now I'm wondering, because it's only in the first two cases where there are two pieces of whatever that fall in and not said explicitly for the third case, is it talking about you don't need to have rov in the like two, you don't need to have more.
So that's a great question, and I think it is very confusing since we talk about the heter and the isser in all these cases, but because we were juggling like the heter and the isser of the pots and the heter and the isser of the pieces, I do think from the fact that like the previous solution seems to be like a creative one and not one that we really see like everybody taking and talking about what's happening with the pieces. I think most cases where it's talking about the heter in relation to the isser, it's talking about the heter in the pot in relation to the isser piece. I do think that that's what the like Shulchan Aruch is generally referring to, but it is a good question, especially in light of this explanation. Okay. I want to move on to the next leaf just because I want to get through all of these. Noam, do you want to read the Shulchan Aruch for Bet?
Sure thing. Okay. Bameh devarim amarim shetolin b'chol elu lahakel afilu ein haheter rabba al haisor shein haisor gam ken rabba al haheter aval im haisor rabba al haheter ein tolin lahakel. So Shulchan Aruch says, with regard to what were these things said, in which we can be lenient, we can lean to be lenient, even when the heter is not more than the isor, meaning when she'enas or gam ken rabba al heter, when the isor is also not bigger than the heter. However, when the isor is bigger than the heter, we can't be lenient. So he significantly limits the first if to a case where we have more heter than isor.
Or equal.
We're talking about it. It's just that borderline case where they're exactly equal.
Exactly
That's
equal,
the
yeah.
only-
It's a very big okimta. It's like,
Right.
oh, you don't need it to be rove. Just has the tiny difference between it being exactly bigger and then being the same measurement. That's where it's applicable.
No, but still, you still have the
to some
general kula of not requiring
Oh.
shishim.
For sure. It's just like it is, like I said, I think it is kind of like startling coming after the first one, where I feel like it's not the intuitive way that, like, if it weren't for this saif, that I would have read the first saif. Does somebody want to read Yavni, can you read the Bet Yosef on this, the bet? I think he just does a good job of explaining how they arrived at this rule.
Yeah, can you give me the first couple of words? Because I don't have letters.
ומה שכתב באמת דברים אמורים שתולים בכל אלה להקל.
וכולי, אבל אם האיסור הבעל ההיתר אין תולין כל כך להקל, היינו, אקשינן בבחורות, ביבמות, oh, it's a replacement, got it, ריד אמר, אף על פי שלא רבו, וסבר, who's that? Rabbi Yehuda?
Rabbi Yochanan in my version.
Rabbi Yochanan, thank you. בדרבנן לא באינן רבייה, והתניא מקווה שיש בו 40 sorry.
Mikveh. Like
Yeah,
a
Tanya
water.
mikveh שיש
There's like
בו
a lot of tutzvahim in that,
40
but
sah.
talking about a mikveh and the replacement of the water.
מכוונות נתן שאה ונטל שאה כשר. ואמר רבי יוחנן, so we're talking about a case where there's a mikveh with 40 with a certain quantity, and you take out one unit and you replace it with another unit, then
Right.
it's okay.
Mikavanot means like
Okay.
exact.
Thank you. Exactly. 40. כשר, ואמר רבי יוחנן עד רובו. מה אליו דנשתייר רובו? לא דלא נסלק רובו. So I'm not sure what the rules are in the mikvah, but there's something about that it needs to, you need to replace the water, and it needs to be
Is how much can you take out? How many can you take out and then replace and it still be kosher?
Right.
So he says,
you can't have taken out the rove. So there has to be, as in at least half of it remaining.
okay.
a good source for exact measurements.
והיא בהתאמה שני הטם דאיקה למימר שני אומר כלומר שאינו ודאי שנפלה לתוך חולין שאני אומר לתוך תרומה נפלה, ולפיכך תולין להקל, אפילו לא רבו חולין על התרומה. שמעינה מהד אקשינן לרבי יוחנן ממקום דאף על גב.
מקווה.
Sorry? Oh.
Akshinan
מקווה.
mikveh.
מקווה.
Okay, it's a misprint here. דאף על גב דלא באי לרבי יוחנן רבויה, מכל מקום שיהיו חולין בתרומה מהבאי דאי לאו הכי לא אמרינן שני אומר.
So he's basically like, from the fact that it's like you might have thought these weren't, as in like the mikveh case is a good example of saying, okay, like you would need half and half. And then it's like, well, I might have thought that it's not comparable to here, but from the fact that they bring that in relation to this situation, we can learn that like while Rabbi Yochanan doesn't require a majority here, as in the case of the mikveh, he does require that there's at least like equal amounts. So it's like, it's essentially kind of like this like somewhat weird seeming rule coming from like a medactic and not strange reading of the Gemara. It's just like kind of very precise sort of way of arriving at this. So the one thing I found interesting is, so we like pretty much everyone agrees that for the shtei kederot and the shtei chatichot, that this is the rule, that this like whole like shavin thing, like you can't have the heter be less than whatever the iser would be. But the shach disagrees that this would be applied all around. So I want to find this. Sorry, this is a long shach, so I apologize that this might be difficult to find in the shach vav. If you can find Alma, I think that's a place we can start from. Alma de b'shtei kederot u'shtei chatichot b'kder echad. I can also share my screen if that would help people, and I have Al HaTorah. So.
That's probably a good idea.
It's right after the
I
icon.
found it. I got it.
It's right after the icon Lashano.
Sorry, which shach are you in?
No, so I'm in the shach vav.
It's about midway through Shachvav, right after Akan Lashon.
So Alma, people see this? Okay. Josh, do you want to read?
What software is this?
That's
This is
all.
It's a really great
Al
it's a
HaTorah?
really great website. Highly recommend. If you look, that you can like, it gives you the Torah, Shulchan Aruch, all of the Nosei Kelim.
Nice. Oh, it's not software, it's a website.
Yeah,
Okay, very
website.
nice.
You can get lots of things. Highly recommend. Okay.
עלמא דבשתי כתרות ושתי חתיכות בכתרה אחת, דין אחד להם. אבל אי אפשר לומר כן, דמוכח בתורת הבית הארוך, או כמו שכתב, והטור לא ראה התורת הבית הארוך, כמו שכתבו האחרונים בכמה דוכתי. וגם מדבריו בקצר נראה כן. אם איתה דסברי לדין אחד להם, הווה לארבינהו ולתנינהו, והווה לסדר שתי כתרות וכתרה אחת, כולה באחד בבה, כמו שסידר הטור, ולא הווה להפסיק שם בהרבה דינים אחרים. אלא מדפסיק העניין, שמע מינא בשתי חתיכות וכתרה אחת, אפילו חתיכת האיסור רבה על הכתרה, מותר. מה שכתב, כמו שביארנו, לא קאי אלא מה שכתב קודם לכן דרבנן אמרינן, שאני אומר, ועל זה כמר, וכמו שביארנו דאמרינן בדרבנן, שאני אומר. והדקה אמר, אף על פי שאין ההיתר רבה וכולו, אי הכי נמי דאפילו ההיתר פחות שרי, אלא נקט הכי משום דבעי למיתני בסיפא, ואם הוא איסור של תורה, אין מתירים, עד שירבה ההיתר על האיסור. והרעה בבדק הבית, שם חולק על הרשב"א, וסבר ליד אפילו בשתי קדרות שרי. אפילו האיסור רבה להיתר, משום ספקא דרבנן לכולה עיין שם.
So
I lost it.
no, that's okay. I think some of it gets kind of confusing. Some of it's him just explaining sort of the technicalities of why he thinks the Rashba holds this way. But basically, at the end, we get the even more Mekel opinion of the Ra'ah, which does not find its way at all here, which is that like basically in none of these cases would you need the heter to be bet on over the Isser. But he does bring the fact that basically he talks about the way that the Rashba organized these rules, and that unlike the Torah, who just like smushed all those different scenarios into the first Seif, he's saying the Rashba is like he puts a lot of dinim between the one of Shtei Kederot and Shtei Chatichot and that of like the single Kederot and the Shtei Chatichot. And he's saying that like he doesn't believe that the Rashba thinks that these have the same din. And so the Shach believes that while with the case of Shtei Kederot and Shtei Chatichot, I would need to like have the heter be at least shaveh to the Isser. He thinks that in the case of the Keder Echad and Shtei Chatichot, that I would actually not need that like the heter could actually be less than the Isser. I don't think many other people end up picking up the thread from the Shach, but I thought it was interesting. Because I didn't really see many others sort of pick up on the issue. We're gonna move on for now because I want to get ideally through Daled before we break because the last three have a lot packed into them. Also, as a heads up, I made somewhat crude diagrams for these, which I will continue to build upon. I'm happy to send them out. I don't know how helpful or non-helpful they will be, but I did find it helpful to visualize like what was going on in a lot of these situations. I think it's a very visual Siman. Okay, has anybody not read yet? I don't think so. I'm just gonna read this one real quick because Gimel is thankfully pretty straightforward. היה איסור של תורה, אין תולין להקל לומר לתוכו איסור נפל, עד שיהיה היתר רבה לאיסור כדי שיתבטל בתוכו מדברי תורה. Right. So like in this case, and what we also ended up accomplishing in Bet is that we bring the case of the like something that's Aser D'Oraita and the thing that's Aser D'Rabbanan to be very close to identical. In the sense of like, okay, in the things that aren't the Yisrei D'Oraita, I need them. The heter can be like equal to the shear of the Isser for me to be able to say Shani Omer. In the case of the Yisrei D'Oraita, there has to be a rove of the heter, right? But again, like we talk about rove often, I feel like when we talk about rove, we often conceptualize the pieces cases where it's like 2-to-1. But rove can literally mean, and I know there's some disputes about this in different cases, but rove can literally mean like 51% versus 49%. You know, so it's not necessarily that big of a difference in this scenario. But yeah, so this is where we see that like the ruling for the Yisrei D'Oraita is technically more stringent than for the non-Yisrei D'Oraita, but not so dramatically like Lamaisa.
In other words, we still do not require 60.
Yeah, we still don't require Shishim, unless obviously, and that's talking about this is talking about Mim B'Mino. If we had Mim B'She'eno Mino, then we would require Shishim.
Wait, where do you sure? Yeah, is that true?
Yeah, I mean we get into this also in later ones, but as in because we had Mim B'She'eno Mino, and the assumption that most of these people, most of the NSA candidates be working with is that like these end up being cooked or like meaningfully mixed with whatever is in the pots. And so if they're cooked, then like actually, if they're cooked even min b'mino, some of them say you would need shishim.
Okay.
But definitely min b'she'eno mino, you would need shishim. It's still right that you need shishim to batel min b'she'eno mino, like in
Right.
lach balach,
Right.
like
The
flavor transfery kind of scenario.
Right. Shach and chet says min b'mino.
Yeah. Right. Dafka sagi barov l'chud, right. So min b'she'eno mino presumably need shishim for devar Torah. Okay. Go back again. I think everybody has read already. Asher, do you want to read Dalin?
Oh, I thought I was muted. היה יותר רבה על האיסור, כדי שיתפטר בתוכו מדבר תורה, תולין להקל. The heter was more than the isur, so that it can be considered batel inside of it, according to Torah. Then we're inclined to be mekil. כיתת שתי קטרות, אחת של בשר שחוטה ואחת של נבלה, ונפלה חתיכה נבלה לתוך אחד מהן, עם ההיתר שבקטרת ההיתר רבה קצת על חתיכת הנבלה, תולין להקל. So, hold on. You've got two pots, one basar, one kosher meat, one nevela. Another piece of nevela fell inside the pot with the heter. And in the pot with the heter is a little bit more than the nevela piece. Then we're going to be mekil. The fish, dvar Torah, min b'mino, batel berov. Because according to Torah, min b'mino, it's batel berov. But the Chachamim were a little bit more stringent. They said it had to be shishim. But you got the two pots of one type of meat, and the isur of another type falls in. Then we're not so lenient. Until it's batel b'shishim.
So this is where we get the idea that, like, if this is going to be mimsheno mino case, like, we need shishim because, like, you know, midivrei Torah, like mimsheno mino, and we think there's going to be some kind of flavor transfer going on, like, you need shishim to batel it. I guess this is one of those cases. I think for a couple of these, I was wondering about exactly how people are envisioning the scenarios. I think especially when it comes to the idea of, like, if we have like min and mino of the pots and the she'eno mino, if I know which is the heter pot and which is the usher pot, like, if they look the same, I'm able to identify which is which, because presumably, like, if I know which is the like usher, which is the heter pot, which I need to for these dinim to be effective, otherwise I couldn't eat from either of them, presumably. How do I not know which the piece fell into?
Why would
I heard a splash and the piece was gone. But I was looking the other way, turned around. The piece was no longer on the shelf above the two pots. It's in one of the pots, but I don't know which one.
I think I'm specifically interested in the case of the one that we mentioned at the end here, right? Where we would need like shishim, as in, like, I think it makes more sense when we're talking all about mino, which, like, also is the majority of this siman is talking about, like, min b'mino. And that makes more sense, especially if you imagine, a lot of them seem to be imagining whatever, like a meat gravy stew kind of thing, whatever, the kind of stuff we often talk about when we talk about meat being cooked in pots here. In that case, you could say, if I'm making like a decent amount, then, like, okay, I can't tell which one has one more piece of meat in it. Or obviously if there's cases where there are two pieces, then fine. But if there's a case where I have one piece of isser and it's b'she'eno mino, and there were two gederot that are the same mean, this is not such a crucial question. It just puzzled me how we could have that scenario where I have
you could have two different minim that look the same. right? In fact, the two categories we go after is Tom and shame, right? Neither of those have anything to do with how it looks, right? You could have, and the truth is you could have a piece of, I don't know, duck that looks like a piece of beef. It's not that crazy.
Also, at that point, it doesn't matter, right? If you can tell, because even if you know that it fell into the heter one, it's batel, right?
Well, you'd have to take it out if you could identify it.
If you could identify, if you could
And
find the
like,
piece itself, but
yeah, in any of these
Yeah.
cases, like in most of these, we're like clearly working off the assumption that I can't take the meat out.
Right.
Because again, since we're like generally talking about like,
Because
we're talking
then you'd know which one it fell into.
right.
So no,
Yeah.
yeah, why not say swan meat and duck meat? You know, they probably taste the different species.
I am not a Bucky in the different flavors of meats, but I will take your word for it.
No, they could taste the same, but there still would be different species. But anyway, it's min b'she'eno minnow, and they look the same. You couldn't tell.
I was actually this one. I was more puzzled by the idea of the piece that falls in is going to be I guess maybe this was also mentioned in some of the earlier halachot. What are the chances of I've got a pot of meat boiling here, and a little piece of meat sitting in front of it or on the shelf above it or whatever? That little piece is going to be a rove over the pot. Like, when would that even be an issue?
Well, so this is where I think there's actually, that's a interesting segue. Not interesting. It's a good segue into something. I think this is the Prisha again. I can try and find it / I also can just kind of summarize, but the Prisha reminds us in this scenario, and I think actually a couple of the other sources also did. I just remember it in his, that we need to remember also, he's like, this works because we have like the idea when it's mean to me, no, he's like, you should remember that what we're realistically talking about is mean to me, no, vish no me no. Because he's like, most of the people are like, what we're envisioning here is like, meat and some gravy and some juices, right, in the pots. And so like if piece of meat falls in, then that's actually mean v'mino v'she'eno mino. And while we saw in the Gemara, remember there was like the kula for those who think min v'mino eno batel, that in those scenarios you can be like saleket mino and just consider it versus the she'eno mino. The Rashba in one of our earlier simanim, I think Sadi something, I can look it up, said that you can also use that kula the opposite way, right? Which is that in scenarios where min mino could be batal barov, and there's also a she'eno mino, I can be seleket she'eno mino, and just if the min would be batal b'mino, then it's able to do that. So he's reminding us that that's the principle that we're probably working off of here, because he's like, realistically, most of these people seem to be envisioning like a little gravy meat thing going on. And I think that's the best way of explaining how that could happen, that like maybe there's a decent amount of gravy juices in the pot, but there's not that much meat. I don't know. Does somebody have a better answer for?
I mean, there does seem to be the thing in the Taz he's dealing with actually the 50-50 case in the Taz and Bet, where he says, well, if you can know an exact amount, like how did you not know if like which one got dropped into, right? Come on, just like I knew I had this much. And he seems to think that this is a case where you knew the exact size of the meat, but not necessarily what you had in either of your pots. So you could imagine that I just wasn't paying attention to what was in my pots before, and I don't know.
Yeah.
But I do like the Drisha's explanation. But
right, the Drisha has the whole thing of like, oh, I find the big piece and little piece. Yeah, so I didn't read the whole Drisha because it is rather long, but the one that I pointed out like is also, again, like a lot of those Sikalim are trying to figure out like how we could arrive at some of these situations. They're just trying to figure out like what actually is the situation we're dealing with. And so he envisions this one where I find like, right, like the big chaticha and the little chaticha, and I know the little chaticha might be heter. I don't know if the big chaticha is heter or iser, and so that's how like, yeah, he's trying to figure out like these scenarios of like how do I know enough about these different amounts that I can apply these principles that we're stating, but not know enough that all of this like kind of suffix is still at play.
What about a case where many pieces fill in of Isser? And that's where we could have, and they're all the same size, but many, many pieces fill in to the point where, we have row, we don't have row, or we have exactly even.
Well, I'm assuming if many, I'm not sure, as in like, you can talk about like Lav Dafka with some of these things, but given that they like make a
You're talking about Haticha, right?
numbers, I'm not sure that we would be able to do this if it's just like a bunch of pieces flunking into my pots. I think it might actually go with like individual pieces.
Another,
But it depends if they fall in once or all fall in at the same time.
if you have 40, if you have,
If they fall in one at a time, then each one becomes batel birov, and so it's no longer an issue.
no, let's say you have 40 pieces of heter and 40 pieces of Isser, and your chef threw the 40 pieces into one pot of it, and the 40 pieces and the other 40 pieces of Isser into the other pot, and the chef doesn't remember which ones you put where. You're saying that wouldn't be the same case? Maybe you're right. I mean, it's not. It does talk about haticha.
No, it may like maybe, and that like honestly is maybe like a more operable way for us of envisioning this, especially when we're talking about amounts, like envisioning these like kind of large quantities that are still equal and just kind of applying the same principles. I also just wanted to address, so with for Ash, that actually wouldn't work if they were falling in bit by bit, because we have this distinction. On the one hand, we have this idea of like liquids, that we get this Gemara where it talks about like how you could, I think we looked at it, but it talks about how like you could like have like yain nesach being poured into like a bor permitted wine the entire day, and like it would be like rishon batel, that like each drop as it entered would be like batel, and so you could just like keep pouring it in, and they would keep being batel in the rest of like the bor. But most of the poskim are like, that's specifically because of like liquid, which is like fully kind of like dispersed throughout things. But that with like entities, we can't just keep saying that, oh, it's batel barov, when ultimately I end up getting like way more Isser. That eventually we have like a choser b'neor kind of situation.
Lexie, why couldn't it be a case where you have literally like, it's like 2 pieces of meat in each kedera, and you have 2 pieces of meat on the counter, and you forgot which one, or one fell into each of them, and if it was a big piece of meat.
It totally could be. I wasn't the one who raised that question. I'm really not the best person to ask, because I have never cooked meat in my life, so I don't really.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah.
I don't really know the logistics. But like it totally could be that like you're actually only cooking a couple pieces of meat, and it is like the numbers that they're presenting here.
Yeah, I mean, I might be wrong. I was just curious why that can't be the case, right? Like, maybe there's something I'm missing. Yeah.
I don't think it can't be. I think people are like finding it unlikely that maybe if we're talking about only one meat falling in, like, oh, like if you have like a pot, where I feel like when we talk about like pots, we're envisioning like, oh, you're cooking like a thing, as it were, like kind of like maybe a more, I feel like when we talk about a piece versus stuff in a pot, we think about the pot as being a more substantive entity. And so I feel like it's working off that intuition where people are like, this is kind of a weird scenario where I wouldn't have more in my pot than in like the little piece that fell into it. But A, it totally could be possible, so that is the amount. And B, what Rav Nachum suggested could also be possible, that like we're actually just dealing with much larger amounts in these equivalent ratios. I think we're gonna do a break now, and then we can do Hey Vav and Zion when we resume. So yeah, let's come. Hey, Isaac, do you want? I can start showing my screen again. Isaac, do you want to read? Oh, I don't know if he's back. Maybe somebody who's already back. No, do you want to read Hey in the Shulchan Aruch?
Happy to. היו כאן 2 קדרות של היתר, ולפניהם 2 חתיכות, אחת של היתר ואחת של איסור, ונפלה אחת לתוך זו ואחת לתוך זו, אסורות שתיהן, אפילו באיסור דרבנן. אין בשום אחת כדי לבטל האיסור, אבל אם יש באחת מהן לבטל האיסור, שתיהן מותרות. So you've got 2 pots, both of heter, And before it, and then in front of them, they got two pieces of meat. One's heter and one's isor. And one falls into the other. Then both pots become forbidden, even if we're dealing with isor derabanan, unless there's enough in one of the pots to nullify the isor. But if there is within one of the pots to nullify the isor, then both are permitted. And this Lexie, this goes back to sort of your general klalim at the beginning, that it's easier to say something was forbidden and now it is still forbidden, as opposed to in this case where you would have to say something was once permitted and now it is forbidden.
Right, exactly. So like we're fine in either of these cases. Like, and on the other ones, it's like, okay, something's already usher, then I'm fine saying, okay, some more isser fell into it. I'm not changing the status of anything. But like, again, like we're not comfortable saying like, and I think one of the commentators like phrases it like, what do you see to like usher one of the pots versus the other, right? Like deciding that it would be that like this pot is usher and this is mutar would be completely arbitrary, since like they were both like b'chazkat heter, and like now isser fell into one of them, right? And in the case where there's enough to batel it, then like fine, they're also still b'chazkat heter, because we're not changing the status of anything, right? We're assuming that thing is still heter and it's just like batel d'isser. So this is, I guess, slightly reverse on my part, but I think this is one I didn't give that many sources outside of the Shulchan Aruch and the Torah for this, because I think most of them are discussed pretty thoroughly, like within the Torah Shulchan Aruch and the Nosei Kelim. But I do think that we talk a lot about some of the Shnei Shvilim and fig cases and things here. So I think it would be kedai to look at, let's see, where the Shnei Shvilim is down here. So first of all, does somebody want to read, Isaac, do you want to read this Mishnah? Oh, this isn't Shnei Shvilim. Sorry, this is a Ktziot thing, but this also comes up in this case.
Okay. Ubezo Rabbi Eliezer Mekel, Rabbi Yehoshua Machmir. So Rabbi Eliezer is Mekel and Rabbi Yehoshua is Machmir. B'dores likra ktziot al pi hakad ve'no yodea ezel hi. So like you're like stomping something on the side of a vat.
Basically, you would like smush the figs in, like in little like cakes.
Gotcha. And you don't know which one is which. So like one of them is mutar, one of them is kulin, and one is truma maybe. And Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rino tam ki ilu hen perudot, v'hatachton not ma'alot et ha'elyonot. So Rabbi Eliezer says you view them as though they are like two separate things, and the lower one lifts up the higher one. Rabbi Yehoshua Omer lo ta'ale ad sheyihu sham me'achadim. And so Rabbi Yehoshua says basically nothing happens or is effective until you have 100 of these little cake things, or these
right of these like jars that have the like pressed cakes in them. I mean, this dispute between them is not as much what comes up in our thing, but basically Rabbi Eliezer thinks like I can view all the different pressed fig cakes in my jar as if they're separate entities. So if I have like 100 times the amount of the latest like truma one that I smushed in, they can all be batel within that jar, and I don't need to go anywhere else. Whereas Rabbi Yehoshua thinks that like I view this jar as one whole entity. I put truma in it, now it's usher, and I need 100. That's like a truma jar, and I need 100 other jars of these fig cakes to batel it. This ends up coming up in questions of like ownership and what it means for other things to combine to batel. Trying to see, I thought I gave you guys the Shnei Shvilim, but I'm trying to remember.
It's somewhere in here.
Where are these?
Oh, in Pesachim.
The second one, right?
Pesachim Yod.
Yeah. Okay. So does somebody want to, who hasn't read it? Yavni, do you want to read Pesachim Yod?
Yeah, can you make it bigger?
Yes, I can.
It's yeah, there you go.
Is that better?
Thank you. ציבור אחד של חמץ ולפניו שני בתים בדוקין. ועתה עכבר ושקל, ולא ידינן אלהי על אי להי על. אלהי על, אלהי על. היינו שני שבילין. דתנן שני שבילין, אחד טמא ואחד טהור, והלך באחד מהן ועשה טהרות, ובא חברו, והלך בשני ועשה טהרות. So there's something about a mouse coming out of, I didn't learn this in advance. There's something about a mouse coming out of two things, and you're not sure where it came from, if from the one from chametz or from the one that's not of chametz, and then so you assume the worst in this case, yeah.
Well, no. So I have this like pile of chametz basically, and we have these mice that we think are just incessantly carrying around our chametz into our houses, in unpredictable ways. And this pile is in front of two houses that already been checked that don't have chametz in them. And so like what, and I don't know where the mouse entered. So he compares it to the Shnei Shvilin case, which is
that you have two paths that and one is tameh and one is tahor. You don't know which one is which. You go on one, then you should assume that you have become tameh, and then if someone goes on the other one, they should also assume that they become tameh.
Well, so that's not what it's saying in this. This is confusing, and also because we do see a scenario where a single person walks on one of the paths and then like does essentially like purifies themselves or whatever, and then walks on another. But in this case, I believe they use asahat taharot. Rashi says like nagab taharot acherkach, that they like handled, like
you're separating truma.
Yeah, right. They handled truma, for example, after. So each of these people, if they're impure, just like ruined some truma or whatever. And so now we have like these different opinions as to what happens in the scenario.
רבי יהודה אומר, אם נשאלו זה בפני עצמו וזה בפני עצמו, טהורין, שניהן בבת אחת, טמאים. Rabbi Yossi Omer, ben kach uven kach tamein. So Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is that like each one of them separately would be considered tahol, but if you ask both of them, given that you know that one of them must be, then you assume that they're both tameh. And Rabbi Yossi says, in any case, they're both tameh. Amar Rava ואיתמה רבי יוחנן, בבת אחת בדברי הכל טמאים, בזה אחר זה דברי הכל טהורים. לא נחלקו אלא בבא להישאל עליו ועל חברו. So now an opinion on those those opinions that that in fact it's the only everyone agrees that if you ask all at once, then they're tameh. If you ask them both at once at the same time, then they're tameh. And if you ask one after the other, everyone agrees that they're both tahol. And the only difference is that that someone was asked about, one of them was asked about both of them. Did I get that right?
Like one of them was asked about their status and the other person's status.
Right. Rabbi Yossi midame le levat achat, v'Rabbi Yehuda medamele leze achar ze. So one holds that case is as if they were both asked at once, and another says that that's as if they were asked one after the other,
Right.
and
So
therefore.
a big thing that we end up having here, thank you. The big thing we end up having here is to what extent we see this case then as comparable. And by this case, I mean the Shnish Vilim, not the Tzibor, although this Gemara would argue they're all the same thing. To what extent that's comparable to our scenario with the Heder pots if we have two owners. So we see there's basically this machloket between the Ramban and like everybody else as to whether there being two owners or not makes a difference. Obviously, as we just read in the Shulchan Aruch, he explicitly states that is that in this one? Yes,
I think it's the Nosei Kalim on this one.
Sorry, it's all the Nosei Kalim on this one. Actually, it's maybe in the
next one though.
It's in the Torah. Sorry, the Torah is the one who in this one explicitly states here, right? Ve'en chiluk ben im shnei hakderot shel adam echad umishal shnei bnei adam. So the Shulchan Aruch gets rid of that like explicit statement, but the Beit Yosef, when talking about it, is like, well, he made that statement like la fuke, the opinion of the Ramban. Which the opinion of the Ramban is that this case, if we have two different owners of the two pots in this scenario, that basically each one would be able to say, my pot is permitted. And that this is similar to the case of the Shnei Shvilim, where like one of them, like he's saying, okay, it's the same thing. Like one of those people has to be Tameh, like we, and nonetheless, like when they go like Zachar Zeh, we tell them both they're tahor. So like similar in this case, like one of these pots has to be aser, but nonetheless, if it were like two different people, then we would be able to say each of them can like say, oh, it was the other person's thing that it fell into. But most of the other Nosei Kalim do not like this. I believe it's the Rashba who uses the principle, right, that we've got that you brought up again, Noam, that like seems to be the underlying thing here, which is like, no, that goes against the very like thing that we have here. It's not just about like, I can't usher something that's mine. It's that I can't like, I shouldn't be relying upon ushering something that's in the like chazakah of like heter, right? And so if me being able to consume something is reliant upon my fellow's pot being usher, then like the shani omer doesn't work. Right? It has to work by saying something can remain in its like presumed status. Does that make sense?
I noticed something also about these cases in the Gemara. Weren't they all cases where both pots have the same status? There's both people have the same status. You never got a case where you had a mixture where one was mutter and one was aser.
Yes, true? Right? Because like in all these things we're saying, like we think it would be like incredibly arbitrary in any of the scenarios, right? Where we don't know, and both the things started off being mutar, tahor, whatever it is, to say that like one of these people or things is tameh, or one of these things is asar and the other isn't, like on what
right.
basis would you decide that? Right.
Exactly.
Wait, I didn't understand that, because the very first halacha talked about two pots. One was heter, one was Easter.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, if you start off,
those are starting off. Those start off as heter and Easter, right?
Okay.
So like, right. I mean, it's like the example that you gave, right? Like I say I'm cooking next to this random goy, and like that's a pot of Isser. It's totally fine for me to say that the nevela fell into the goy's pot. He doesn't care. Like that pot was usher, it'll stay usher. I haven't changed anything, right? Whereas like if I've got like two Jews with two shchuta pots, and I say, oh well, you know, Plony's pot is the one that's usher, like I have actually changed its status. Does that make sense? I know it's like, yeah, it's very complicated. I think a lot of the like this is one of the longest Beit Yosef's is on this one, and I think the whole discussion around the two people and also the shin if you look gets kind of complicated. We do have an opinion that comes, I think it's the Shach who you can see it in the Bach itself, but I think the Shach also brings it, that the Bach and the Maharshal, they're also dealing with a different question, right? So first of all, we had this issue of ownership, right? Which the Ramban says it makes a difference. Everybody else says it doesn't. The Torah is very explicit about that. So we don't hold like the Ramban. The other issue with this halacha is that it seems to potentially contradict or not take into account the last halacha in the Siman, right? If people remember, and we're about to get there, the last halacha in the Siman is about siruf. It's about the idea that like multiple pots of heter can combine to batel something. So like when I say in this case, sorry, I'm going to go back to this. When I say in this case, does that mean like, okay, if I didn't have enough in one of the pots to batel the iser, why don't they combine to batel it? Why isn't this something that falls under the scenario of Zayin? Which some people say that it's because it's two owners, which I think is the simplest answer, right? Like that's my opinion. Other people can disagree. I think the simplest answer is that it's the two owners, which everybody in Zayin agrees is a case where we don't do tziruf, right? So we have two different Jews, their shluta cooking together,
right.
and that's why.
I don't understand the question exactly, because isn't you're talking about hay? Isn't hay where maybe the assumption in hay is that there isn't enough in the two together to mavatel it?
Well, I think though. Sorry, like I didn't mean to jump into that. But,
no, I think you're just gonna.
I just got this from the Taz, right? He says, right, because it says, right, it sounds like you need one of them to be able to be mevatel,
right,
and not to be combined.
And also the language of im ein b'shum echat kadei levatel ha'isur, right? It implies that like that one of them in and of itself would need to have the amount to batel the isur. It doesn't say like im ein b'shnehem kadei levatel ha'isur. Like that, if it didn't have that language, then that would probably be the simplest answer, right? Just say, okay, this doesn't fall under Zayin because even combined, they don't have that. But I think this seems to imply that I need a singular pot to be able to batel the iser, and thus the pots are not combining to perform bitul. So the one answer is that it's just they're separate owners, and so as we'll see in Zayin, things don't combine when I have separate owners. Another answer is the Bach and the Maharshal. I think say that they don't combine because basically two pieces falling into things is a bigger deal than one. Wait, actually, no. Wait, is this talking about this thing? No, this is yes. Okay,
It's
the Bach, things, right? Yeah. So he says the case like the scenario we mentioned in Zayin is if I have like two pots of heter and one thing of iser that falls into them, right? So that's like one nefila. And in this case, it's a piece of heter and a piece of iser falling in. Now, like, they basically say that like that's a bigger deal, that it's like a more tendentious case in this scenario, and so that's why the pots don't combine. I personally find that explanation a little bit less compelling, but if anybody feels like defending the Bach and Maharshal,
well, what are his words exactly for bigger deal? How would you translate that to Hebrew?
They use actually like gerat fe. Like I say bigger deal, but as in they say it's like a lesser scenario than that when there's like a singular nefila. But I think when the implication is like a gerat fe, as in it's like a less suitable case for kind of doing this siru.
A less good case.
Can I make an argument for that? I'm going to try. I'm just like No, because sorry, the hey really bothered me, and so because of
Yeah,
this, and
it's
so
a difficult one.
I think there might be something to be said about that. I know that a piece fell into each of them, versus in the case in Zayin, I know that a piece only fell into one, sort of thing, and so therefore, like it's only I know that one of like I can tell a story that one of them never had anything fall into it, versus in this case, I know that something fell into each, and so there's kind of like a higher probability, very slightly higher, that each of them might have the Isur in it, because both of them, not only both of them have something, both of them had something fall in, and one of them is Isur, versus the other case is only one of them had something fall in that I know is Isur.
I mean, when do we combine things? Let me give a stab at it.
Well,
Yeah.
When do
we'll get into that. We can I mean we can talk
No,
about
but
it right now.
I just want to say why this is not combining things. This is not combining things because we know that there was an event that this thing fell into this pot, and there's one of these two fell into this pot, and one of these two fell into this pot. We know that there were two distinct events. There were two separate events. Whereas in Zion, it's one piece that there was one event, and that event was it fell into one of these two pots. So if we look at it that way, I think we can see the combination in Zion where we don't see it in Hay.
So I think that's good, and I think we're talking right about like again when like under what principles we think things can combine, which again we'll get into more in Zion. But I also didn't mention I presented this that there were two answers. There are actually four answers. So I'll read the Darchei Moshe really quickly. What he says is v'nireh dekan marei she'en ba'gderot min acher ulekach lo mitztarfei biyachad levatel ha'isur. אבל כשהן מין אחד ועומדים להתערב ביחד, שניהם מצטרף לבטל האיסור אם הן של אדם אחד, וכמו שהתבהר סוף סימן זה. So basically, the Darchei Moshe actually, I mean, he brings in two of the answers, but he's like, A, it does need to be from the same person. But B, they also need to be the same mean. Because like we have the assumption of like, okay, I'm probably not going to be like mixing two completely random things together. So like this assumption of, oh, they're like omdim litarev is based off the idea of like they're the same entity. So he says this is talking about a scenario where the two heter pots are not the same type of food. And so I can't use the tziruf because like I'm clearly not going to mix them. Which I think is also, I think that's a good explanation. So now I want to look at the Shach Yud Gimel, because he also gives another explanation and I think addresses some of the others nicely. Who hasn't read in a while? Josh, do you want to read?
From where?
Just the Gimel Shtein Mutarot.
ואין חילוק בין אם שתי קטרות של אדם אחד, או של שני בני אדם. עד כאן לשונו. עד כאן לשון טור, מתורת הבית הקצר, ובערוך מבואר שכתב כאן להפוקי הרמב"ן, דסבירה לי דבישל שני בני אדם, ובאו להישאל בזה אחר זה. אפילו אין בשום אחד מהם לבטל, אנו מתירים לכל אחד ואחד, ותולין דבישל חברו, דבישל חברו נפל. ועיין לאל סימן קטן י"ט, דעיקר כהרמב"ן. וכשהבח, מה אלו אמרינן דשתי הקטרות מצטרפים לבטל כשהם של אדם אחד, דלקמן סוף סימן זה. ותירץ דהכה, כיוון שיש שתי חתיכות, גרעת אפי. וכך כתב המהרש"ל, בהגעותיו לטור, ומביאו הפרישה, סימן י'. ולא מסתבר לחלק בכך, גם בדברי הרשב"א בתורת הבית הארוך, משמע, דאין חילוק בזה, אלא נראה, דלא מיירי כאן, אלא מדין שאני אומר, אבל מדין צירוף לא מיירי, כלל. הכה, ואפשר דמיירי הכה, דבהנך גבני, דלא מהני לקמן, צירוף. כמו שכתב בסימן קטן י"ח, וכך כתב בדרכי משה, as you read, ובדרישה סימן ט', שוב ראיתי בדברי מהרש"ל, פרק גיד הנשה, סימן נ"ו, שהוא עצמו חזר מדבריו, ופירש כדבריי, אלא שאחר כך כתב בסוף הסימן דלעניין הדין, סברה חזקה היא דבשתי נפילות אין מצטרפין עיין שם, וסברה זאת צריך לעיון.
Yeah. Okay. So, again, sorry. I think I keep giving you shachs, and sometimes they're kind of complicated. But I think here one of the main things he doesn't like the suggestion. First of all, he doesn't like. Also, I misquoted. The Bach was the one who raised the kushia. I don't know if the Bach was the one who raised the solution of the Gerat faith thing. This here he says the Maharshal and the Prisha, who use that. Also, sorry, I'm hearing an echo. Okay. Yeah, but he says that this just isn't talking about Siruf. He's like, it's not that Siruf Dafka wouldn't work here. It's that like this Seif is coming to teach us that Dafka Shani Omer wouldn't work here. That like these are different principles, right? Like Siruf is one that's based off of actually like combining things for a certain shear to do bitul. Shani Omer is premised on like not needing bitul, right? Like and some of the other Nosei Kalim in various places make this distinction, right? That like Shani Omer is different than a case where I'm able to batel an Isser. Like this whole kind of like principle is reliant upon the fact that I can actually just keep something in the status that it was. So I think it's clever. I don't know if I fully buy it, but I think it's an interesting way of saying like, no, this actually like you don't need to resolve this with Zion. They're just talking about like two different principles. So that's why you don't have Siruf mentioned here. He does also whatchamacallit. And he mentions again he's like, some people agree with me. But he mostly thinks that there is a distinction. He seems to be pretty adamant about the idea the like shtei chatichot thing wouldn't have a different deen than the like chaticha achat. He seems to be less adamantly against some of the other resolutions. But specifically he doesn't like the Maharshal and the Prisha's one. Okay. We'll have any other burning thoughts on Hay before we move on to Vav?
Maybe we want to do this when we get to Zion, but right, in Yud Chet, he brings up, right, he starts with the case of, well, like, what if we have one is a milk pot, and one is a meat pot, right? You know?
Yeah. So yeah. So we can talk about that in Zion, but it's
okay. Yeah, I'll leave it then. It's just so.
Yeah. No, it's a funny thing, and a couple of them bring it up, which is a good point when we're talking about combining stuff. Okay.
But that's what the Shach is trying to say there is like perhaps this is the case where there's just you're never going to combine these two things for whatever reason it may be, right? It's
right. Essentially, he's like, this isn't like a case where Siruf is like applicable, so we didn't even bring it in, and so I'm just talking about Shani Omer.
Yeah, he had, but there was like exact language that he. Hold on, so I got to find it again. What did he say? He's something high gavne to low, mahadid siruf or something like that. I kind of have.
Where it wouldn't work.
Yeah. So.
Right. So so you can say he's like, he's just phrasing. You can say like it's Dafka. He's just phrasing like the Darchei Moshe, for example, differently, or the other people who are like, there's two ba'alim, and or it's like two minim. It's something where like they wouldn't combine ergo, we're just talking about this other way that they would potentially be able to be permitted. Okay. So for Vav, who hasn't read in a bit? Anyone want to volunteer? I feel like I've called on all of you a lot, but it's not very long. Okay, go for it.
All right. היו כאן שתי קדירות של היתר, ונפל איסור לתוך אחת מהן, וידעו לאיזו נפל, וחזר ונפל איסור לתוך אחת מהן, ואין ידוע le'ezo nafal. Ani omer lemakom isur harishon nafal gam hasheni. Right. So you have an initial fall. You know exactly where it fell. That is now asur, and or potentially, and then it like comes out and falls. It probably could be another piece, but it could be that falls again. It's we say that it fell into the first falling place, shall we say? Okay. Should I read the Haggah too, or you want to?
Go for it.
Okay, Haggah. V'davka she'ein shishim levatel ha'yisur shenafal sham. Aval im haya shishim levatel yisur shenafal sham. Havekilu lo nafal sham yisur klal. Right, but if you had 60 in the first place then there's no problem, right? It's as if there never was an Isur that fell in there. The thing is,
I think you skipped
Finish.
part of the.
Oh, did
Oh
I?
yeah, I think you just get the second scenario where this.
Oh, did
does.
I did?
About im nafal for the tochachat mehen ve'en yadu le'ezo nafal.
You know what's so fun? Im nafal Isur letochachat man. My Haggah is in the middle between those two.
Whoa, interesting.
Yeah, in my printed edition. Who knows? So I was wondering why it was there. But okay, I'll read the second case of the Machaber. I'm back in the Machaber now, and then I'll read the Haggah again. All right, Aval im nafal isur letoch achad mehen ve'in yadua le'ezo nafal ve'achar kach nafal isur letoch achad mehen ve'yadua le'ezo nafal. So we're switching the order of when you know and you don't know. Shtehen asurot. Then it's the case where both of them are asur, and yeah, now I'm going to read the Haggah the way you have it, because now it makes more sense in some ways, right? V'dafka she'ein shishim levatel yisur shenafal sham. Aval im haya shishim levatel yisur shenafal sham havekilu lo nafal sham yisur klal. So I really wonder what is anybody else have printed? Anybody else working off a printed Shulchan Aruch?
I have the same edition as usual, so yes, I have the same issue, but it's the same volume. So
I have
Okay.
a printed one, but it's at the end.
It's at the end. All
Yeah,
right.
I also.
Thing. Yeah, I would guess that the end it does seem to make more sense. So yeah, but I can see how you would put it in the middle, I guess. In any case, right, like this one seems to be primarily like building off of our idea where we're talking about chazaka again, right? Where like in the first scenario, like one of these pots just becomes usher, right? And so then like in the second case where I don't know, like if I say it fell into the usher pot, fine, I haven't changed that pot status, it was already forbidden. Whereas in the second scenario, when I don't know with the first nefila what happened, as we just learned in Hay, both of those pots are now usher, right? So I can't then go back and correct it, because now they're both b'chazkat isur, right? So like I can't then correct it to be like, oh, one of them's heter now, whichever one the second thing didn't fall into.
No, this is just a logical consequence of what we already learned, the two dinim that we already learned.
Right.
Yeah,
Like I think this
Both
builds.
parts.
I was wondering, yeah, if like how is this different? Does it teach us anything new? Like, is there a hava amina of why, based on what I saw before, I wouldn't just say that the first
I don't
case
think
is
so.
a case of Isur and heter pots, and an Isur falls in to one of the two, and vice versa.
I think it's just application, continuing the logic. It seems to me just an application of what we learned.
Okay.
Seems to me. But
Yeah.
Lexie, you thought about it more.
No, I would mostly agree. Like I think this one mostly is building off of the logic. I mean, like the Rama kind of adds in like whatever the Shishim thing, but I don't think that really is adding a Chiddush either. I think most of it is just building on like this idea of like, yeah, when there is something that's Hater and Isser, we can like be Tola, the like uncertain falling of the Isser to the thing that's already Isser, but we can't like change the status of a thing with the Shani Omer. That seems to be like basically the underlying thing.
Because in
here.
the first case,
we might have thought,
okay.
we might have imagined that like if it's first, if one fell in and we didn't know which one, then it's a sul. But then like once the other one falls in, we say like, oh, let's say that, but this is coming to say.
Right. He's addressing Hava Amina, right? Like you might have thought that it can work like Lima Freya. And they're like, no. Once in the first case they both became usher, you can't go back and correct that. Now they're both like b'chazkat isur.
Did people look at the Shachya Dalid? Because he's got a fascinating take on this. I just started reading it, but
Do you want to read some of
I'll
that, Lab?
go for it.
I know he has some questions about about issues of Doraita. So
Yeah, well, that's exactly. Yeah, he Bach. Well, he brings the Bach. It's really the Bach. He Bach the Maikamash Malan. Hakol shekenu mimash katav le'el sif aleph de b'shtei keterot achad shel heter ve'achad shel isur v'chaticha achad shel isur de talinan shenafal isur letel ha'isur ve'kol sheken kan de ikal memar de l'makom shenafal isur rishon nafal gam hasheni. Okay, so this is the exact question we're asking. Like, what does it teach you? Well, what additional thing are we learning here? V'tiretz de hacha ashma'inan afilu b'isur de'oraita talinan lekula lamar de l'makom shenafal isur harishon nafal gam hasheni. וכך כתב באיסור ההתר כלל כ"ו דין י"ג דכל מה שכתב בסעיף ה' וסעיף ו' אין לחלק בין איסור דרבנן לאיסור דרייתא עד כאן לשונו. All right, he's going to be tamal this, but I haven't had a chance to read
That's
this.
quite a Hiddish.
Yeah, it's a huge finish.
no, it would be a very big deal, and kind of that would seemingly kind of call almost into question the unshakability of one of the klalim that I gave, which was about like the Doraita versus non-Doraita status of things here.
Mm-hmm. Should I keep going?
So now the yeah.
Should I try and keep? Should I try and finish this? Should I keep going? So
yeah, it's not too much more.
All right, great. All right, Vanitama. He'ach efshar lamar b'deoraita shani omer v'halo shas arucha rosh perek kama de pesachim daf yud umuskan mikol poskim delor minan shani omer b'deoraita uma bekach shenafal mitchila isur echad l'sham hakol steka deoraita l'chumra.
You know what? I think of an answer. I already, before I read any more, let me just see if I can guess. My guess is what we talked about last week. The suffix is suffix deraita lechumra derabanan or deraita. So this could be actually derabanan only aser, and there because it's a suffix deraita aser derabanan. So now it's derabanan aser, so it's actually derabanan. So we can
say it's.
I don't know.
It's a fun theory. I don't think it's the one the Shach gives, but
all right. I'm just thinking that. Okay, go ahead.
All right, so one way or the other, we'll see if we get there. But like he's like, come on, everyone agrees that we don't say Shani Omer. Okay. Ve'od tema amay nema be something be'isur. What is the samachay there? Do you have a
say for a truma?
I probably be'isur deraita shenafal makom sheyesh bo kadei levatel. Niti be'isur leheter sham, ve'iyenti be'isur veheter sham, ve'ra'iti shelo katav kema shekatav abach, rak achar shehivi hadvarim shebesif he besif vav, katav v'nireh shebekol zeh ein chiluk bein ima isur deraita or derabanan ad kan l'shono. So he's
about to give his answer.
Okay.
With the Yoreh.
So, Venire, de Valomar, is it Lotema?
Lotema.
Yeah, Lotema. Kavanda Rashba, Vehanim Shachim Acharav, Lo Katvu de Isur de Raita, Veshur de Rabanan, Dinoki Isur de Rabanan, Rak B'shtei Kederot, Sheachad Mehem Shel Isur. I want to go, if it's an Isur de Raita, but the Shir's de Rabanan, it's like a de Rabanan. This which like throws apart our entire previous thing that we had about Isur Ramashu.
No, it's generally Isur de Raita, except in this one case.
Because the Shir is the Rabbanan.
Yeah. No, he's saying it's a Deraita, which is a Shir Rabbanan, is only treated as a Rabbanan in one case.
Rabbanan. Yeah.
It's only in one case, but it's generally treated as Deraita.
Right. Like we had it earlier in, some earlier Siman where we said like the Chatzi Shir Doraita, right? So.
Yeah. Imken Dafka Keshaya Kedera Achat Muchzeket Kvar Beshel Isur. Anorim de ein chiluk bein isur de Rabbanan le Doraita. The Doraita v'shir de Rabbanan kigon min b'mino berov. Aval kan de akterot hem shel heter. Im ken nema davka be'isur shehu mamash de Rabbanan tolin lehakel. Aval lo be'isur de Doraita v'shir de Rabbanan. Kamash malan. Deleta ela bechol zeh ein k'mashalan deleta. Ela bechol zeh ein chiluk ben isur deraita v'shur derabanan o isur derabanan uvahachi lakasha. Nami mashik shahabach diyesh lamar dashmu'inan hacha de afal pisha kedera hayta kavar muchzecha beheter. El hashta benefila itrae afil hachi talin lakula aval beisur deraita mamash badai ein chol tolin lahakel.
Right. So he's like, there is a chiddush, right? You might have thought that like only in the kind of case we talked about and this is also addressing his kind of like, you can see his kind of articulated question of like, what would make this case different, if anything, more makil, according to the Bach, to say that like, oh, this is even with an Isser D'Oraita in this scenario, what makes this different than Aleph when we had like Isser Vadai and a Heter Vadai?
Wait,
he's
you
like,
stopped
no.
wait, Lexie, you didn't fully explain his terrors.
Okay, so right, so his teretz is that interwoven. So the Shach says that like this is just coming to teach us that even though in general we do treat like an Isser D'Oraita with the Shir D'Rabbanan as like D'Oraita, in these scenarios within the Siman, we do treat it like D'Rabbanan, and you might have thought that only applies to Aleph, because I mean, and this is where I was going with the kind of like unwritten question that he has, where like the Bach treats it as if this case would be possibly more makil than the one that we had in Aleph, that like even Isser D'Oraita. And the Shach is like, no, you might have had a Hava Amina that would be more machmir in this case, because in like Aleph, one of them is already Vadai Isser, and here we had two things that started off Heter, and one only becomes like Isser because of this like kind of Nifila that just occurred. I might have thought that I actually can't use this kula of treating an Isser D'Oraita with a Shir D'Rabbanan as D'Rabbanan. So Kamash Malan, the Seif is coming to say, yes, you can.
In other words, and so when the Bach said, also true of a D'Oraita, he meant of a D'Oraita which was a Shir D'Rabbanan.
Shir D'Rabbanan, yeah. So in other words, this is teaching us that this is the same as the case in Aleph, even though we might have thought it wasn't exactly the case in Aleph. So
precisely.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, what are about the interim Seifim? But anyway, all right, leave that. I know we have to get to Zion, so.
Yeah, we're gonna do our last Seif. All right. Who hasn't read in a while? Who feels a hankering to read the Shulchan Aruch?
I can read.
Amazing.
You're welcome. Okay. היו כאן שתי קדירות של התר, ונפל איסור לתוך אחת מהן, ואין ידוע לאיזו נפל, ואין בהכרח כדי לבטל האיסור, ויש בשתיהן כדי לבטלו שניהן, מתרוות לבטלו. So if you got two pots of heter, and then you have an isur that falls into one of them, you don't know which one it fell into, and one of them alone doesn't have enough to for nullification to happen. But if you combine the two of them, then there's enough for nullification, then they combine and that forbidden piece is nullified. And furthermore, even if one of the pots is in the house and the other one is in the second floor, then they combine. And this is if 100 pots need to combine to make this happen. במה דברים אמורים? בששתיהן של אדם אחד, לפי שכל שהן של אדם אחד עתיד להתערב, אבל אם הם של שני בני אדם, אין מצטרפות. When do we say these things? It's when the two pots or the 100 pots, however you want to say it, are owned by one person, because at the end of the day, those are going to be mixed together. And so we can sort of view them as if they were already together. But if it was owned by two people, then they don't combine. The Rama adds, "V'yesh machmirim de'afilu be'adam echad ein lahakel, u'letzorach hefsed yesh latir be'adam echad, u'mihu ein loch lo ela lachar she'arbeno yachad da'az kvar nitpatel ha'isur." But there are those who are machmir on this, even with regard to one person who owes the pot, that you shouldn't be mekil. And in case in a hefsed, you can be matir with pots owned by one person. However, you shouldn't eat them until they are actually mixed together, because then the Isur is nullified.
Is that last comment referring to does the Beit Yosef agree with that last comment? That last line that you have to actually mix them together?
I don't think he does.
Don't think so, because the Beit Yosef says, "So Adam echad atid lehitarev," meaning the assumption is that they're going to be mixed together, which means even if they're not mixed together now, that's okay. But according to the Ramah, they need to actually be physically mixed together now.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I mean, the Beit Yosef, I can like look it over again, but I'm inclined to believe he doesn't think that, because he's actually personally inclined to think that actually even the pots of two people should be able to combine. And it's because of like the opinion of Rabbi Shimon that he's like like a Rav Muvhak. I'm gonna respect him and say that like, we're gonna like paskin lachmir in this case and say that it can only be with like a single person. But since he is inclined to say that even the two people pots could combine, I'm assuming he doesn't require physical.
Okay, let me just push the other way, which is that what sense is there in requiring it be of one person so that it will, because he would normally put them together? Why would you, if you're not going to actually put them together, then why should it matter? It'll either go all the way the other way. It's even two different people, and we're not caring about whether you mix them together. But once you say they have to be the same person, then what help does it do that it's the same person if you're not going to actually mix them together?
Well, so we have kind of actually the opposite argument that's going to be made in the Shach, which I want to read. But first, I want to just look at, Joel, you want to read this little Chet and Taz, because it's what you were bringing up earlier?
Sure. Yoreh, you mean, right? It's it should be Chet and Taz. Yeah. Sorry. I was looking at the Shach. Atid litarev.
Yeah.
לפי זה, לפירוש זה, פשוט הוא דאם השני מיני היתר אסורים בתערובות, כגון האחד בשר והשנית גבינה, אין מצטרפים לבטלו. All right, so you've got your pot of meat and your pot of cheese next to each other. Obviously, they're never going to be combined in the future, and therefore this doesn't work. וכתב רש"ל, דאם הם אינם עומדים להתערב, כגון שאחד יתבשל במתיקות והשני בקיוה probably, אינם מצטרפים. So if you have the, was it spicy and sweet or something, or
it's like
savory, yeah.
I have like a dessert and like a savory dish that like, yeah, and he's like, and it's interesting because like in the Siman of Hay, like the Ramah used language of like mean and me no. And this seems to be implying it doesn't have to like necessarily be dafka the exact same thing, but it can't be things that I know I like either absolutely cannot or like really would not mix. Like obviously I can't like mix basar v'chalav, but also like I'm clearly not like atid litarev, my like dessert and my main course. And so like those don't combine to batel the isser that fell in. And then I also sorry, was someone saying something?
Atid litarev means it's like you're assuming that you're going to be eating them together as dishes as opposed to somehow, yeah.
I assumed it means like eating, like them being like meaningfully mixed together physically. Otherwise, it makes less sense to me that the B tool works, that they combine, if we don't imagine them being actually kind of mixed, as opposed to like I'm eating them in the same meal.
But mixed like later on your plate, as opposed to potentially, as opposed to like you're going to mix the two pots together.
Maybe. Okay, and so I misattributed earlier. So it's the Taz who's actually going to talk about what the deal is with like the mixing of the two pots. So I think I'm just going to read, I'm trying to figure out, no, I'm not going to read this entire thing because that seems excessive. But he basically wants to address the question of how can we mix these pots together? What does, okay, I'm going to start with here, Veneer Redley. People see where I am?
Which
Okay,
does
Veneer Redley. Huh?
Is that tet or yud?
This is yud. So v'nireh li tmoa b'ma shekatav deman dematir lo matir ela la'achar hatarvovot v'zeh eno. Like, so he's like, people who think that like actually isn't permitted until after you've like mamash mixed them. This is not the case. Daha harashba hu dematir v'hu mevi b'tor debayit haruch daf daled Yerushalmi shamar Rabbi Zer Rabbi Chia b'shem Rabbi Shimon haya lefanav shtei kupot ובזו 50 סייע, בזו 50 סייע, נפלה סייע תרומה בתוך אחת מהן, ואין ידוע לאיזה נפלה, רצה לעלות מזה, מעלה מחצה מזה, ומחצה מזה, מעלה. לפיכך, אם היו באחד 100 או באחד 50, אני אומר לתוך 100 נפלו, ומשם הוא מרים, ולא משל 50, הכאן לשונו. פירוש לעניין שצריך לתת חלקו של כהן נותן דווקא ממקום שנתבטלה התרומה, אם כן, אם תאמר שאין היתר אלא לאחר התערבובות, היך שייך לומר שמעלה מחצה מזו מחצה מזו. He's like, if the reasoning is that I have to give the kohen a bit from where it was bottled, then why do I need to do mechza from this and mechza from that? Why isn't it just you need to give one from the whole thing, right? So he's saying that like Yerushalmi implies that like the things are batel before they're actually physically mixed, right? כן כבר נתערבו ונעשה הכל אחד, אם לא כן הכל אסור. ותוד, אם אין היתר אלא אחר התערבובות, למה נקט שמצטרפים שניהם? לשון צירוף אינו שייך בזה, כיוון שכבר היו אחדים על ידי התערבובות. He's like, if it doesn't actually become mutar until I literally mix them together, why are we talking about tziruf? Like that's you're just mixing them together. כן נהיה פשוט שאף אם לא נתערבו כיוון שמן התורה מותר על ידי ביטול ברוב, רק מדרבנן צריך 60, וכיוון שיש ספק לאיזה נפל נכנסו שניהם בספק, שניהם מצטרפים לבטל. מותר כל אחד בפני עצמו, וכיוון שעתידים להתערב, חשבינן כאילו כבר נתערבו. ומה שכתב יצר בהתר, דאפילו למען דמתיר, לא נתכוון על דעת הרשב"א דמתיר בזה, אלא דהכי כאמר שאין לפסוק כן להלכה להקל, ואפילו מי שירצה להתיר כן להלכה לכל הפחות לא יתיר, אלא אחר התערבוות. Right, so like this idea of like, okay, if you want to paskin like this, you still shouldn't actually permit it until after they've mixed. אבל לעולם דעת הרשב"א שמותר אפילו בלא תערובת, עדיין, דאילו אחר התערובת מותר אפילו בשני בני אדם, דמלוד בשני בני אדם, מכל מקום הווה לכתחילה אסור לערב, משום אין מבטלין איסור לכתחילה. Sorry, this is the bit I really wanted to get to. He's like, how, if you think it doesn't batel until they're mixed, could you mix them? Wouldn't that be mevatel isur l'chatchila? And so, in b'damacha mutar la'ared l'chatchila, dim tomar kain mutar l'chatchila metam dechashvinan like ilu kavar nitarev. Af anu nomar d'be'emet mutarim afilu be'lo tarovot kivan dechashvinan like ilu kavar nitarvu. Elal ken d'be'emet kenu eladu hachmir b'zeh la'arvot chila. Zehu gam ken kamato rama. He's like, there's multiple reasons that it doesn't make sense to say that like the bitul doesn't actually happen until I've mixed these things together, right? He's like, it doesn't work for a variety of reasons, including that it doesn't work with this Yerushalmi. It also doesn't work from the fact of like, otherwise I'd be doing like bitul isur l'chila, which we've said is forbidden. So he's like, no, everyone agrees that like the bitul is affected while they're still separate. And that's why we use the language of tziruf. But it's just that like, to be machmir, we like combine them. Maybe it's like to remind people that like this is why it can be batel, right? Because they are actually being like mixed together. But you didn't need that for like the process to be affected, as it were. Okay, there's not much time left, so I don't know if we have time to read it inside, but I just want to mention lastly, the Shach has an interesting comment where he brings up the Bach, who says that like this whole tziruf actually only works if you don't say chanan and bishar yisurim. But he's like, for those of us who do say chanan and bishar yisurim, this doesn't work, right? Because like the thing should already be neset nevela, the thing that didn't have enough in and of itself to batel the iser. And the Shach says that can't be the case, because like if that were the case, then the Rama wouldn't have used the language of like yesh machimirim da filu ba'adam. Like no, he would say like va'anu no hagin, right? Like because that's chanan b'shar yisurim. So the Shach is like, we can't say this is actually for like that doesn't work if I hold chanan. And so I think it's the Bach gives this explanation that the Shach thinks is like a bit like dachuk, which is that this is a case of like yavesh v'yavesh dafka, where they don't say chanan. And that's like kind of a big limitation. The Shach says no. It's actually that we don't say chanan when we don't know where a thing fell. That like chanan is only when I know where the thing is. But in the case where like I don't know which thing it even fell into, then none of these were chananed, because like none of these even definitely have isser in them. And so that's why this isn't a concern. And even for all of us Ashkenazim who hold chanan b'shar yisurim, we can still apply this principle theoretically, bimkom hefsed, as the Rama said. Okay, that is the Siman. Lots of fun stuff. Any final comments or questions?
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
You made it fun.
Very good.
And Chag Sameach to everyone.
Chag Sameach, everyone. Chag
Sure,
Sameach.
I can send out, if people are interested, I can send out the kind of diagrams I drew. I don't know if they're helpful or not, but
Sure. Send them.
And at
Some
the very least, they'll be
visualization.
amusing. So,
I think in the end we don't paskin like this, Rama. I have a feeling. Taz certainly doesn't.
in which respect? As in like the fact that like we
The yesh machmirim.
Shulchan Aruch, like we don't hold by the yesh machmirim. That makes sense.
We don't hold by. Yeah, I don't think we hold by the yesh machmirim.
I mean, I think like that makes sense given that basically all of the Nosei talking about this seem to both think that the Ramah fundamentally agrees that this works, and that they themselves fundamentally think that this works, and they're like, yeah, this is like chumrah, but like they all seem to think that basically this process is effective and talk about it like it's something you could do.
But I just also thought of a possible teruts for what you were last talking about. Because tell me what you think of this. That the last thing and anybody can go if they want, but I just had an idea that perhaps you're saying, why is it that we care if you're going to put them together if it's already batel, like it's already like, or if it's not already batel, if you have to, then how could then it's mabatel yisur lechatchila. So what I think is like this: since you're going to eventually put it together, it's as if when it falls in that it's fell into the combined thing, and therefore when you do go and mix them together, which you have to do, it's not batel, it's not mevatling in Isser L'Chatchila, because you were going to do that anyway. You're doing what the Isser of mevatling Isser L'Chatchila is in order to create a bittul. But if it was my intention to do it anyway, like my example of the grinding chickpeas, and it destroys the bugs that are in them. That wasn't my reason for grinding the chickpeas, but I was going to grind them anyway. So that's not called bittul l'atchila. So if I'm going to combine these things together anyway, then it's not bittul isur l'atchila. And
You're right. That's standard. That's great.
Think that's correct. I think that still the Taz raised multiple like kind of kushiot against the idea of that. The others being this Yerushalmi that seemed to imply that bittul was affected while they're still separate, and also the idea of like, why do we use this language of siruf?
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm just talking about that one point.
But
yes, I think in the end the Yerushalmi is what is kovea, and I think the Chai Adam brings also the idea that one could be in the Aliyat Gag and one could be in the basement, and the concept is that the safek is on all of these things, and therefore they are joined together, even not physically, but they are joined together by the safek. and therefore the bittul occurs at that moment, at the moment of the suffix combining them, even before. And I think you're right. The Rishalmi sort of proves it. I just was referring to his second argument didn't seem convincing.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good way of addressing the Mevatel
Anyway, Yishakayach. Sorry to I'm sorry to go over time a little bit, but Yishakayach very much. You everybody got? I sent out assignments. If anybody has a question, contact me.